In this video, we're going to show how Boardwalk can be used to support the interaction between a manufacturer and its suppliers for different components needed in order to run its manufacturing process. Now, in this particular view, I'm looking at the template that the buyer would work with. So in this case, you can see over here, here's the buyer. And then this buyer has a number of different suppliers that they need to interact with. So in this case, we're seeing Avnet and Future and TTI. Now, across the information that's being collected, there's three types. There's new buys, there's change orders, and there's backlog. And this information comes directly out of their ERP, saying I need to be able to requisition this information. The alignment between what the different supplier provides and the different parts by the manufacturer are all handled through master data, again within the Boardwalk environment. But basically what you want to be able to do is to say, for a given buyer, they need to be able to interact with their suppliers across all these different parts and have a workflow that says, for a given part, what's the supplier status, what's the manufacturer status, and then from a workflow perspective and a collaboration perspective, how many are needed and at what price and when from the buyer, and then likewise from the supplier, how many are available, what's their selling price, and what's their commit date. And then based on the information that's provided here, particularly gaps in terms of the differences between these different areas for pricing and availability, there's a workflow process that's built into this that says, okay, well, based on the information that I collected, then there's a set of exception filters that are being run, and depending on what level the exception filters are set, then different people have to be able to approve whether or not this particular acquisition is going to be approved, and if so, then they're going to generate the invoice to go ahead and purchase it. So at a certain threshold, the buyer can do it, otherwise the manager has to do it or the VP has to do it. And all of this is handled through a workflow capability inside of Boardwalk, where it says, for this set of information, this particular row, I either want this supplier or this user or this particular role to be able to interact with the data, and they only see that information. They don't see anything else. Now, the Boardwalk system also consolidates the information for all these users. So if I look at this report shows me all the different parts and total counts across suppliers in terms of the different status by different months. Of course, you're able to do this inside of Excel. This information can also be pushed off to Tableau or back to the ERP system in terms of a reporting process. Now, what we want to be able to do is we like to be able to collect the information from the suppliers. Well, how do we do that? Well, each one of the suppliers is sent a template that is an Excel file that basically has everything they need in order to interact with the system. And what they do is they receive a blank file with just a welcome tab, and then they basically log in. And when they log in, only their information is pushed to the system. So you can see here, this is the same data in the database, but only Avnet is being shown as the supplier here. There's no other data in here because this is the template for Avnet. So by access control, only the information that is supposed to be filled out by Avnet is filled in. Now you notice here, in the buyer one, it was saying how many do I need. Well, now this is saying how many I'm available. And I'm not able to change anything in the available. I can only, in the balance needed, I can only change the available. So if I change this to be 3,000, because this is going to be okay, and then I'm going to make the selling price be 0.03 to get a little bit closer to where they're interested in. I'm finding the commit date, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a comment out here and say more changes. Now, everything that you do in Excel today continues to work exactly like it does. The biggest difference is that now when I do a submit, only the data that is supposed to be sent is sent across to the supplier, or in this case, sent back to the buyer. And as you notice here, the supplier status column is shown, but the buyer status is not. So they're not able to see the status from a buyer perspective if you're a supplier. So I'll come in here and I'll say submit. And when I say submit, what it does is it logs me in, and then it does a validation against the data. So you'll see that it scans some of the rows. It checks to make sure that things have been updated. And then I say, these are my changes. And as these changes are pushed back to the database, then it's going to make sure that there's no gaps between the information for quantities, dates, pricing, anything else that's supposed to be filled out. Okay, once it's completed, now I can switch back over to the buyer, and when I go back to the buyer, all they have to do is they go in and refresh their workbook. So in the case of the supplier, they made changes, they did submit, and now as the buyer, I want to be able to refresh. And when I do this, it goes to the database and it finds the changes from all of the suppliers. So no longer do you have to do any manual consolidation. The consolidation is automatic. And the change comment will show the old value and the new value. So if I slide over here now when it says refresh successful, and I say, well, let me see what that change was, then as I take a look at the update and I scroll over here, I'll see there's a change value that says that the old value used to be $2,800, now it's $3,000, and that this value used to be $1 and now it's 3 cents. Now, I can go back at any time and I can click on this and say, well, show me how this has changed over time. So it's always showing you the most recent information, but you can ask the database to show you how has this data changed over time and what types of updates have they made to pricing or dates or availability for any one of the items. But the most recent information is always available when you click on refresh. And since this is all consolidated automatically, then all the information in terms of the latest data from the different suppliers and the status of all the parts is automatically updated. And depending on what the result is of the validation in terms of whether the buyer needs to be approving it or just the manager or the VP, then there's workflow to be set in that in addition to workflow for going in and saying who's going to manage it, then you can come in and you can say, you know what, I need to either approve it or I'm going to go ahead and change suppliers because they're not meeting my expectations. So this would then reroute this data, and the next time one of these other suppliers updates their workbook, they would automatically see this row show up, and then they too would provide information on this part to support a collaborative exchange for supplier planning with this manufacturer.